Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me for this segment, we have Eric Fanning, CEO of the Aerospace Industries Association, to discuss National Aerospace Week and the priorities the industry will be focusing on. Eric, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
You got it. And tell us about the Aerospace Industry Association and how you work with your members.
Sure. There are associations for everything in Washington, D.C. We represent manufacturing and service providers in aerospace and defense. We've got over 300 member companies, from very large global companies that most people have heard of to small, even family-owned companies that are further down in the supply chain, so that we can represent the full ecosystem of aerospace and defense manufacturing and service providers.
What are the four key industry issues AIA is focused on?
Well, we're structured sort of in general in three basic areas. That's investment, framework, regulatory framework, and workforce. On the investment side, it's advocating for the government to do its part in this partnership that makes American manufacturers competitive globally and keeps America at the cutting edge of this. It wouldn't work if government and industry weren't working together for success. On the workforce side, that's sort of the crown jewel of the industry. We have about 2 million jobs across the sectors. They're very high paying. You can raise a family on these jobs, send kids to school. Communities can thrive with jobs. Every member of Congress wants these jobs in his or her district or state. And the real meat of what we work on, our association, is the framework part, the regulatory part. These companies are introducing new technologies and advancing the way that we communicate, connect, travel, et cetera. And there's no way to roll out that technology safely if government doesn't do its part, working with us, private industry, to set up the regulations and the regulatory framework necessary for this new technology.
And with the work developing and executing legislative strategies that are of interest to member companies, what is the most challenging part of that?
Well, actually, I think this answer comes as a surprise to most people, and I never waste an opportunity to say this to the Hill. The biggest challenge is trying to get the Hill back to regular order, the government back to regular order. The way that we budget right now is very disruptive for the private sector. It creates a very confusing, inconsistent demand signal that makes it hard for industry to decide where they're going to invest in R&D, capital expenditures, et cetera. We start almost every year, certainly the last 8 years I was in government in the Obama administration, with a continuing resolution, and most people think that means the money is still flowing, but a continuing resolution is just saying keep operating off of the last year's budget while we figure out the current year's budget, the year that we're actually already in. And so if you have a new start, a new program, if you're expanding something and it's not in the budget, you can't do it. And so it's hard enough for anyone at that scale to budget in 12-month increments, but it's not even that anymore. It's at 3 months, then 9 months, or 6 months, and then 6 months. And so the hardest part in dealing with government really is what I would say is a dysfunctional budget process because we can't get those budgets, those authorizations and appropriations passed in time for each year.
Yeah, you can certainly see how that could be problematic. Eric, do you see more collaboration with the government and private companies going forward as we tackle the issues of competitiveness and innovation and, of course, cybersecurity?
I do. There's AIA is over 100 years old now, and there's a great history of cooperation. I think, because this isn't even a partisan issue, Democrats and Republicans alike understand the importance of this industry for American security, for our economy, for tackling big problems like climate change. And as I said before, we couldn't do this without good cooperation between government and industry. Sustainability is an example. Airplanes today are 80% more efficient than they were when they first started flying. A flight today has 50% less emissions than one just 30 years ago. But there are things we need government to do. This week, for example, the Biden administration announced a major commitment to sustainable aviation fuel, which is a key component to making existing engines have less emissions, because new technology is great, but it can't solve everything, and it takes a while to get new technology into the fleet. So I do see more cooperation going forward as we tackle these problems that are so big, like climate change, that are bigger than industry or government can do alone, or even our country can do alone.
Let's talk about National Aerospace Week. What are some of the key issues the industry is focused on?
So we use this week, Congress actually designates this as National Aerospace Week. We use it to talk about what the industry is, how big it is, the economic impact it has. Almost, I think it's $874 billion in output last year, even during COVID. It was pre-COVID the largest net trade surplus segment in the manufacturing industry. These jobs, as I said, pay on average over $100,000 a year, which is 41% more than comparable jobs in other sectors. So we try to talk about how important this industry is and how important it is to make sure that we as a country, America, remains competitive, so we don't cede that to some other countries. Big things that we're focused on this year include sustainability that I mentioned. Workforce is always an issue. A couple of components there really. One is continuing to focus on diversifying the workforce so that we know we're taking advantage of the best talent the country has to offer, that we're not leaving anybody off the table. But we can only do so much. We can hire people who have the degrees or the experience that we need, but we need government, again, that partnership, to be investing in STEM education and making sure that education is reaching diverse components of the country so that we're bringing everybody in that we can. And then in COVID, there are two things that really popped out of COVID that we're still focused on. One is returning to flight, getting people back in the air, getting them traveling so that they explain to them how airplanes are safe, doing things that make them feel safe so they'll return. And that's a major focus for us because the airlines, of course, are the customers of the manufacturers. And so we've got to make sure that they're doing well and they're healthy. And then the supply chain. COVID hit the supply chain really hard. What most people don't understand is most of those companies in the supply chain are doing defense and non-defense work. The good news is the defense budgets stayed healthy through COVID and even now in the Biden administration. But the commercial side was hit pretty hard, and big companies have more tools to get themselves through difficult economic situations than maybe the smaller companies do. So we've really been focused on our supply chain and on the industrial base to make sure that it stays whole. Because as you know, these engines, for example, are complex pieces of equipment with lots of parts, and you need them all for the engine to work and for the plane to fly. So that's been a real focus for us and will continue to be for the future.
Eric, you brought up a great point before about having a properly skilled workforce. And it's not just for our defense. You have all different types of industries competing for that STEM talent. I believe the last number I heard was over 750,000 tech jobs are unfilled. So tell us a little bit more, expand on that, your focus on a 21st century workforce and what your priorities are going to be as we have every industry competing for the talent that you're looking for.
Yeah, workforce is the key element of this. If you talk to the CEOs of these companies, they will eventually get around to talking about workforce. It is a constant hunt for talent, not just with other industries, but within the industry. Companies are always poaching from each other, which is one of the reasons those wages are so high in this industry. I think a key component or a key piece of data to talk about or show how important the workforce is to these companies is even during the economic downturn of COVID that hit the commercial side particularly hard, our overall workforce only went down 4% last year. That was the key thing. The first thing the companies were focused on was liquidity, making sure they had access to capital. But right after that was workforce and the industrial base, keeping those two things whole so that when we got past COVID and started to pick back up again economically, they'd have that workforce in place. And these companies, they're not just recruiting at engineering schools as people graduate. They're in local schools trying to explain what aerospace and defense does, get them excited about it, get them excited about STEM, tell them that if they want to be an engineer that works on getting us back to the moon or getting us to Mars, they need to start preparing and thinking and taking classes like math and science as early as elementary school. So they're looking long term to build that pipeline for their workforce.
Got it. And Eric, in the last minute here, you've held a number of senior positions representing the aerospace and defense industry. What have you learned? What has struck you the most now that you've been engaged in both the public and private side of things?
I think what's interesting to me is that neither side understands the other very well. They have very different incentives, and I do wish there were more opportunities for people in government to work in the private sector and vice versa for that understanding, because government doesn't understand how capital flows and what incentivizes that. We want industry to be investing in research and development to develop this new technology, but government does things that in many cases can preclude that or make it more difficult. Like I said earlier, not budgeting consistently, not sending a clear demand signal that doesn't change from year to year. And on the industry side, it's the same thing. They are focused on what incentivizes, and they do this very well, that flow of capital. That's not what someone in government is doing. They're trying to get an end result as opposed to that efficient movement of resource towards innovation that the private sector does so well.
All right, Eric, we appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thank you.